About the business of open source. So my name is Jim Hall. So just to kind of do an introduction to myself here. So by the way, we're going to talk about a little bit about open source today. I'm going to do introduction to myself, but I'll talk about open source software and some topics around specifically open source software and developing that community. And then after that, we're going to do an overview of the two micro courses that are coming up starting in January of next year. So if you're here to learn about those two micro courses, they are going to be after this little mini lecture that we're about to do. But first of all, let me go ahead and start with an introduction of myself. So as I said, I'm Jim Hall. I've got a pretty long career in open source and free software. Actually goes back to 1993, the first time I used free software. I was a student, undergraduate students, and that's when I first started using GNU utilities. I'm sure a lot of us had that early experience in college. Well, that was definitely mine as well. I also started to use Linux almost right away, also in 1993. And, I'd been a big DOS user up until that point. If you follow me on opensource.com, where I do a lot of writing, or Cloud Savvy, where I'm now writing as well, you'll see some of my background and my history, where I obviously grew up, as a lot of us did, in the 80s on the Apple II, then DOS systems, and then from there I kind of migrated over onto Linux. But I was such a fan of both the open source model and being able to build your own tools and share them with other people, and people able to contribute back to make that software better, to fix bugs and add new features. And I was also such a fan up until 93 of DOS that I actually in 1994 started my own open source software project. The first time I really, was doing more than just contributing to open source software, but I was actually creating a project and sharing it for other people to use. And so that was the FreeDOS project. If you go to freedos.org, you can see what that was. So if you remember what MS-DOS was, that's pretty much what FreeDOS does. FreeDOS is basically an open source version of DOS where it allows you to run classic games, legacy business applications, and support embedded development. And yes, in 2020, people are absolutely still doing all of that on FreeDOS today. And so that's been a long-running open source software project. Since that time, though, I've been a maintainer or a contributor or an author of open source software and open source software communities to dozens of open source software projects. And I do really do mean dozens. It's probably somewhere in the range of probably around 60 projects. Some large, some small. One of those projects is the GNOME project. So you may be familiar with GNOME. GNOME is an open source software desktop system. So just like Windows is a desktop and Mac is a desktop, well, GNOME is a desktop for Linux computers. So I've been working with them for, I'm not quite sure how long now, probably in the last 6, 7, 8 years, doing usability testing. And so helping them with making GNOME easier to use. And so if you are a GNOME user and you've noticed it getting easier to use the last couple of years, that's in part to some of the work that I've been doing with GNOME, as well as the Outreachy project. So Outreachy is a project that provides paid internship programs to women and other underrepresented groups in open source software to help them make their first contribution to open source software. And so I've mentored several cycles in Outreachy. I think I've had probably 6, 7, or 8 interns go through that program. It's actually been very fulfilling because I also got to watch some of those interns go on and actually make their career in open source software and doing some of the things that we were doing in those internships. Specifically, we were doing more usability testing with GNOME. I've also been a longtime Fedora user, of course, even before that, longtime Red Hat user, and I've done some work on some Fedora systems as well in terms of developing. But as I said, longtime Linux user back to 1993, and that was, if you're keeping track, that was kernel level 0.99. I think it was patch level 11. Those were the days when you downloaded a new kernel and you tried to compile it, and to add support for your sound card, you might accidentally break your keyboard. So, been part of the open source software community for a very, very long time. And of course, now also partnering with Brandeis and Open Source Initiative to do these micro courses on open source software. Outside of that open source software work, at work, I'm the CEO of Hallmentum. It's a training company that provides training and workshops to help new IT leaders and emerging IT leaders to step up into that leadership role. Also, current IT leaders to get better at IT leadership. I also have other workshops around IT management and things like that. So, what you're getting out of these micro courses is somebody who's not just experienced in open source software, but also has experience doing instruction as well, because that's certainly what I've been doing for the last couple of years in Hallmentum. Before I was at Hallmentum, by the way, I was the CIO for Ramsey County for a little over 3 years. Ramsey County, Minnesota is the smallest geographically, but the second largest by population. It also includes the state capital of St. Paul. Because of the small geographic size but the large population, we face very difficult and challenging problems like population density and things like that. So, the IT leadership over that time. Before that, I was the campus CIO for the University of Minnesota. Part of their system. I was over at the Morris campus, and I was there for about 5.5 years. So total together, CIO role for about 9 years. And before that, various IT leadership roles going back some 20, 25 years. Uh, so long time experience in IT. Also, in terms of professional experience, also have taught and currently teach university level. So I teach at a couple different universities, including now Brandeis, uh, teaching different topics, including technical and professional writing, management information systems, computer science, things like that. So you're getting experience here from somebody with bringing the perspective of open source software, but also an instructional background as well. So I wanted to kind of have this little mini lecture to kind of talk about open source software, because some of you may be looking at these mini courses as maybe you're joined an organization. This might be your first time getting involved in open source software. Some of you may have experience already in open source software. We kind of want to level the field and have this conversation about the infrastructure that open source software projects need to support the development and the users. And so, as you think about open source software, and I mentioned I've been part of open source software for a long time, I've seen some things work well and some things that kind of don't work well. And so kind of the things that work well, the first thing you kind of need to remember is that communication does not happen in a vacuum, right? I think everyone ever has said that somewhere on the line. Communication does not happen in a vacuum. And the key part around developing open source software is communication. People need to be able to talk about the software. They need to talk about the development that they're doing. They need to talk about the bugs that they're finding and the features that they want to add. Every kind of communication needs to happen. And so that's, I think, sort of the core behind the infrastructure that you need to support open source software. If you're going to look at supporting an open source software project, if your organization is involved in open source software, if you're leveraging maybe open source software, you're using it in one of your products, communication on both ends is going to be key to make that successful. So the first place I would start if you have an open source software project is you need a website, right? I mean, that's 2020, you need to have a website. It doesn't need to be fancy. One thing I see a lot of organizations do is they'll try to create a website and they make it really, really fancy, and they get really overworked on adding all these different website features, and they kind of forget what people need to use the website for, right? You need to make it easy for people to learn what that project is about. If that website makes it hard to figure out what the website's about or what the project is about, they're not going to use it. They need to be able to download your new files and your new releases. You need to make an obvious place to go and find that. You can't make your software better unless people are able to report bugs or even request features. And so you need to make it easy for that to happen. It's okay to have an account that they need to sign up for as long as it's a free account and as long as it's obvious to set up an account. But you need to have some ability for people to report bugs. And by the way, there are different kinds of bugs, as we talked about when I did when I was working with GNOME, or as I work with GNOME on usability testing. There's different types of bugs. there's the very standard bugs where it's about functionality and this feature is broken. I try to do these things with the software and the software doesn't do that. It generates an error with this kind of input. I try to read this kind of file and it breaks, right? Those types of bugs are pretty standard bugs. You talk to any of your developers, and those are probably the kinds of bugs they think about. Feature requests are probably pretty standard things as well. I want to do extra thing with the software. I really wish the server platform would do this. I really wish the application system would do this. I really wish I could click on this icon to make it do these things, right? Standard feature requests. But there's also another one, and that is around usability or accessibility. Those are two different topics, by the way, usability and accessibility. But it's very hard to report a bug on usability. And it's very hard to report a bug on accessibility. Why is that, by the way? Because the first thing that developers are going to respond to is, well, it works for me, and they're going to pass on it. So you may have to consider if your application or your open source project is very visual in nature. So it could be a website or it could be a desktop application. You need to think about ways that you can access that input about accessibility bugs where, somebody who's vision impaired isn't able to use the software very well because it requires a lot of clicking and there's no labeling, or it needs to be, usable. So people who aren't able to explore new features of the software. So you need to have a different way to do that. And so there's different ways you can consider doing that. I'd be happy to have that conversation at a later date, but those are, think about the different classes of bugs and the different types of feature requests that your software might be needing to get from your users. You also need to have a community. You can't have a community unless you have a discussion of some kind. And so this could be a mailing list. A lot of older websites or a lot of older projects like the FreeDOS project, we have a website, pretty low volume these days, but so a mailing list works well for us. Other projects might need to have some other kind of discussion forum, so they might actually have a web forum where people can drop in a message. Some other projects are now using Slack, but you need to have some kind of platform for your developers and your users to talk about the software. It's not just bug reporting, but they need to be able to talk about the things that they're doing. And by the way, by following that discussion, you're going to learn more about how your users are actually using your open source software. You need to make it easier for people to get documentation. If I try to access your website and I can't figure out how to use it by downloading the software and just trying it, I need documentation. I need somewhere that actually gives me like a quick how-to. Here's how to get it working. Not looking for a book, not looking for links to books, not looking for documentation as book length, but a quick how-to that says, here's how to get the software up and running. Here's how to use it and do something useful with it. Those types of things. Maybe you're also, by the way, going to write articles for other websites about your software. Link to those, right? Those are different types of documentation. People also need to understand what's going on with the software. So is the software being updated? So if you went to a website and you couldn't find any information or any links about what's new, what's happening, and the last thing that you can find on the website, maybe on the front page, is something dated from 2 years ago, how up to date is that software? You're probably going to be asking yourself, is anybody using the software? They're asking the same thing of you. If you've got a website that doesn't have any news items on it, that just says, hey, here's a release, and that release happened sometime early 2020, and there's no news that talks about other stuff that's going on, is it really going to be active? Are people going to be using it? So make sure people can find very easily the things that's new, and then also make it easy to follow you on social media. It turns out that, yeah, people do want to follow open source software projects on social media. So if you have a very active social media account, that's definitely something you should do. So again, you don't have to have a very fancy website. You don't have to have lots of colors and lots of features and JavaScript and slide-ins and pop-outs and modular, forms and things like that. Just a static web page that talks about the name of the project, talks about, has links for downloading and bugs and discussions and wikis, has a simple description of what it does, and then has a news list. That's enough for most projects. I would also include in there some screenshots, especially if it's a very visual application. Even on the FreeDOS website, which is DOS, we have screenshots, and you can see screenshots. You can see several screenshots about what FreeDOS actually is, so that you're not surprised the first time you use it. But most importantly, it's not open source software if people cannot see the code. They need to be able to see the code to be able to work with it. So how are people being able to interact with the code? Are new developers able to make commits to the code? Can they submit patches? And so there's different platforms that you can use. GitHub and GitLab are probably two of the most popular platforms right now for open source software development. Makes it very easy to do a pull request, to copy someone's code, to make a clone of that code, and even just to browse it if you just kind of want to see what's involved. And so very easy to access that code. You're also, SourceForge is an older one, but you are still finding people are using SourceForge. In fact, FreeDOS project is using a lot of SourceForge services right now, but also Mercury and some other things that are out there. So you'll want to have something out there that people can use and follow to see where things are in the code, and most importantly, be able to contribute back to that source code. So, but the key here is it's not open source if I can't see that code. Now, I mentioned before, you also need to be able to track bugs and make feature requests. So it's one thing to release the code. And you've seen a lot of organizations, particularly about 10 years ago, that would release their source code and it's like, that's it, we're done. Or they at least wouldn't make it in any way obvious as to how to access, how to report bugs. So if you can make it easy for your users to track bugs and open feature requests, your software will grow. FreeDOS started in 1994. Here it is 2020, and we're still doing work. People are able to report bugs. They're able to talk about feature requests, and people are able to fix those bugs and add those new features. And so, it's slower with FreeDOS because it's DOS, but that is what keeps the community alive. That is what keeps the community going, is being able to fix those bugs and respond to feature requests. Lots of different ways you could do that. Mozilla is another popular place, or sorry, Bugzilla is another popular place that people can use to track bugs. There's also, you'll find bug tracking in a lot of the codes platforms as well. SourceForge and GitHub, GitLab, they all have some features of bug tracking, but there has to be some way to track those bugs and those feature requests, so that way people can respond to them. And I mentioned before, it's very important for developers to be able to communicate, and developers need to coordinate. They can't talk about the projects that they're working on, and I've seen this bug in the bug tracker, and maybe the discussion is not going to happen just in the bug tracker, but they're going to talk about it in some sort of a forum. Maybe somebody puts in a feature request, and you want to talk about that in a developer community, and not just in the bug tracker, but you want to have a sort of broader discussion about how that might connect with some other things. And so people need to have a way to communicate, or they're not going to be able to coordinate. If they can't talk to each other, the discussion is going to go nowhere. So there's lots of different ways you can do that. As I mentioned, some projects, especially the older projects, have some sort of a mailing list. As I said, some projects also have Slack or some similar type of forum. Even Google Groups is being used by some open source software projects. And whatever you need to do, so that way people can join a discussion and chat with each other, that is what you need to have. I would say these days in 2020, IRC is being used by some open source software projects. I'm not seeing it being used by new developers. And so if you are setting up a new project right now, a new open source software project, or releasing your code, and you're thinking about ways to communicate, I don't know that I would go to IRC. I would probably go to Slack or a mailing list or some other type of active forum, so that way people can drop in a message and come back later and check out responses. Kind of think Reddit in terms of keeping the discussion going. And then you need to make it easy for new people to contribute. How can I join your project and make my first contribution? And that's one of the kind of blind spots of a lot of projects is, it's one thing to say, well, we've got a bug list out there. We've got a feature list out there, feature request list. But when new developers show up in a project, one of the first questions they're going to ask is, what can I do to help? And so it's a good idea somewhere to have a list of things that that new developers might do to get sort of involved in the project. We even have that, by the way, in the FreeDOS project. We have a list of ways that you can contribute. Here on the left, you can see a screenshot from the GNOME website where they have different things that newcomers could do. If you want to get involved in GNOME, there's a newcomer's guide. It tells you some things you might do with the project. There's documentation is always, by the way, an easy thing to do as part of a project. I guarantee every open source software project out there is looking for help with their documentation. You can see they're also talking about translations. So how do we translate the GNOME messages so that way they can be understood by people who don't speak English as their native language? And so GNOME is available in various dozens of spoken languages. And so they've got lots of different ways for people to come to the GNOME project and immediately find something that could interest them. On the right, you can see a screenshot from the GNOME or the GNU website, where again, they have different lists of things that you could do if you wanted to get involved in the GNU operating system. The FreeDOS website, on my own website, we have a list that's divided into skill levels. And so if you are a new developer, you haven't done much developing at all, then here are some things that might interest you. If you've done more development, you're semi-skilled, sort of medium, moderate, then here's some other things you might tackle. If you're an expert in, especially in DOS programming, here's some other projects that you might do that we kind of could need doing. So, we try to address skill levels as well. And so if you can do that in your suggestions for people, I would recommend doing that as well. And as I say, the key to all of this is open. The key to open source software is you need to make it open, and that means people need to be free to join your project. It needs to be easy to join your project, and people need to see what's going on and be able to contribute to that source code and bring back suggestions for improvements, or even best case scenario fixes for bugs and actual code to bring in new features. And so that's, if you're looking at how do you start an open source software project, or how do you make your open source software project successful, those are the suggestions that I would make for you and sort of supporting that open source software project. So that's kind of the mini lecture around open source software, but now I kind of want to transition to these micro courses around open source technology management. So these are 2 micro courses. Let's kind of talk about what those courses are. So I want people to understand what the micro courses are about. They're going to be 4 weeks, and they're going to be highly interactive. And there's going to be a lot of group work going on, and you can expect a lot of group discussion. The way that I always approach instruction, especially through my training company, I like to look at workshops. I approach everything kind of as a little workshop, and that's what these are going to be. You can expect to have 90 minutes of synchronous discussion over a Zoom type video, and we're gonna run it like a workshop. We're going to talk about things that came up in the previous week. So every week you're going to have some assignments that, okay, these are some things you need to work on in the time between now and the next time we get together. And so at the beginning of our meeting, we'll talk about, all right, so what did you learn? And we're going to have groups report out and talk about what it is that they were able to tackle. So they're going to give a little update there. I'll give a brief discussion about the topic of the week, sort of introducing our new topic. But before that session, you'll also have received some links to videos and other materials to kind of get you started. So you can actually hit the ground running by the time we have our 90-minute session. And expect to find a lot of group discussion. I've got, well, you'll see here in a minute, we've got topics that are going to involve a lot of sort of workshop style discussion. So it's not a sit back and watch my screen while I eat my lunch. It's going to be actually actively participating in that discussion. So the audience for this is kind of pretty broad. So if you are coming into these micro courses, you may already have some level of knowledge of open source software. You might have been involved in open source software before. Some of you may have been actual practitioners. Some of you may not. Some of you may be coming to this as your first time working in open source software. Maybe your organization is just now getting into an open source mode where it's like, well, we want to release our product as open source software. Or maybe you're in a position where your organization says, we are doing a lot with open source software. We've got developers that are using open source software tools. We've got developers that are asking to use open source libraries in their code. We want to use open source as part of our platform. So you may be sort of trying to understand how that's all going to fit into your organization. So you might be new, you might have some experience. It's intended to be fitting a broad audience here. But the goal here is that you want to build a strong practical knowledge of working in and with open source software. And so that's, I would say, really the key of attending these micro courses. So the first one is open source business practices. And as you can see here, the things that you're going to learn in this program. So basically, we're learning about open source software. That's really what bullet point number 1 is about. Number 2 is sort of talking about the different kinds of open source software versus other kinds of software. So is it open source or traditionally proprietary or quote unquote closed source software? And we'll learn about that. We'll talk about, that's what bullet 2 is about. Bullet 3 talks a lot about these different business models. That's really the core of business practices, is understanding different models of leveraging open source software as part of your business. Again, maybe you're using open source software just as libraries, or maybe you're using it as just tools, or maybe you want to do something more like use it as part of your platform. You've got a web platform, a cloud platform, and you want to use some open source software tools or some open source software infrastructure. How does that fit into your business practice? Maybe you want to go the extra step and you have existing software that you want to release as open source software, or you want to make it as part of an open source software community so that you can get other people interested in developing the software with you and becoming co-developers. That's what some of the topics that we'll talk about in this course as well. And that's really what we're talking about in number 3. And of course, number 4 is we will definitely work collaboratively. You're going to find yourself working almost in an open source mode throughout the course. So you're going to be learning and practicing as we go through the course. That's really what number 4 there is talking about. The second micro course is establishing an open source program office. And so just to kind of highlight some of the things that are going on in this, so the outcomes of the open source program office course, you're going to be able to assess your organization's preparedness to be involved in open source software. And there's different levels of preparedness, and you need to approach it from different angles. And we'll talk about some of those risk points and how to evaluate that risk. Again, you're going to work collaboratively throughout this that micro course. You're going to be again almost emulating an open source software project in the way that we're going to communicate and collaborate with each other. And at the end, you will be able to develop an implementation plan that will identify and address any gaps that you find about adopting open source software. So let's focus on the open source business practices micro course first. So it's 4 weeks. And so this is what you're getting in each of the 4 weeks. So the first week is really about open source software and how it's used in business. So some of the discussion topics, and these are actually taken from the course notes. So what is open source software is one of the things that we're going to start with. So if you are coming to this without much experience in open source software, this first week is intended to be a very quick ramp up. So you're going to come back with some, as I mentioned, some project time outside of the micro courses. So every week that we meet, we're going to have those discussions, and that's what's in the darker green. And then you're going to have some takeaway assignments where you're going to do deeper dives and talk about these topics. And so in that first week, after we're done with our discussion around open source software and how it's used in business, you're going to go back and do a deep dive and compare these different license models. In week 2, again, we'll start that discussion by kind of reporting out the things that you learned in week 1, especially in your outside work. But we're going to then talk about how do you leverage that open source software? So how do you apply it? in your organization. And for the outside work and the small group work, you're going to go back and do a deep dive looking at case studies of several of those points. And then in week 3, we'll come back and again, we'll start the conversation by having those groups report out, but we're going to talk about the open source software archetypes, right? The different archetypes are basically the standard models of open source software. And so the deep dive that you're going to do after that week 3 is you're going to do and discuss the organizational investment in open source software. In week 4, we're going to come back and talk about open source business practices, right? That's the title of the course. So that's what we're talking about here. We're kind of bringing it all together. So now everything that we talked about in weeks 1, 2, and 3 is now coming together in that final week. And that's where we're able to wrap it up and understand how do we now put all this together, all the pieces together of the puzzle to build a business on open source software. So looking at the other MicroCourse, establishing an open source program office. And so again, let's kind of look at the breakdown. How is this being broken down? So what are we talking about week by week? So the first week, we're really talking about what is an open source program office, right? You probably heard it referred to as an OSPO in some places, right? Open source program office, OSPO. You're going to have a deep dive that you're going to do after that. So between weeks 1 and 2, you're going to go back and do a deep dive and talk about commoditization cycle in your niche, and be able to come back and talk about that at the beginning of week 2. So again, as we meet again in week 2, we're going to have that report out from those small groups. And then we're going to talk about organizational readiness, organizational policy. So how ready is an organization? How can you talk about that maturity model? What policies need to be in place? What processes need to be in place? And then the deep dive you're going to do between weeks 2 and 3, you're going to go out and you're going to talk about what does your open source readiness look like? And also talking about climbing that readiness ladder. Where are we on the readiness ladder? What do we need to do to get from where we are to the next step in terms of maturity? In week 3, you'll do a report out on that. And then we're going to talk about how do you engage in these open source software communities, especially related to an open source program office. And so we're going to talk about strategies in terms of addressing open source software. And then, and we have some discussion points around that. And then we're going to do a deep dive. We're going to ask you to do a deep dive after that on your organization's investment in open source software, which again, you'll come back at the beginning of week 4 and you'll share that out. And then we're going to talk about, putting it all together. How do we put all this together to actually build an open source program office? Strategic planning for open source engagement. How do you prepare to build that open source program office? And then again, deep dive is to go back and do more work specifically in your organization to understand the things that you need to do in your organization to put that together. And again, there's a week 5 where it's not really a full session. It's really an opportunity to kind of share what you learned during your deep dive. And if I can share comments to help you build that up, then I will. And so what you're kind of learning out of this is that, out of each of these 4-week micro courses, you're able to go from pretty much 0 to pretty good maturity by the end of the program. So if you don't have an open source program office, maybe you have heard that term for the first time today in this webinar. If you don't have an open source program office today, well, by the end of these 4 weeks, you'll be ready to build one. And so you'll understand what you need to do to build an open source program office, who needs to be involved, what kind of things you need to talk about. So that is what you're going to get out of these courses. You're going to go from pretty much 0 to being able to be able to apply it in your own organization.